It was a typical afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood when Naomi Cooper was driving home from a meeting. She had just wrapped up a long day at the office and was eager to get back to her family. The streets were calm, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the road. Naomi didn't expect anything unusual to happen, but as she turned a corner, she noticed the flashing lights of a police car behind her. Naomi wasn't unfamiliar with being pulled over. As a black woman, she had been stopped by the police before, sometimes for no clear reason at all. It was frustrating, but she had learned to stay calm and composed during such encounters. She slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, turning off her engine and rolling down the window. She already had her driver's license and registration ready, knowing this could be a routine stop. The officer who approached her vehicle was a woman, middle-aged, with a stern expression. She didn't smile or greet Naomi with the usual politeness most officers did during traffic stops. Naomi could sense the tension right away, but she kept her voice calm as she greeted the officer. "Good evening, officer. How can I help you?" Naomi asked. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at Naomi's car, then back at Naomi herself, before speaking in a curt tone. "You were speeding back there. I need to see your license and registration." Naomi frowned slightly but didn't argue. She knew that wasn't the case. She hadn't been speeding, but she handed over the documents anyway. "I was not speeding, officer," she said, trying to keep her tone polite but firm. "I've been driving at the speed limit." The officer looked at her with a cold, uninterested gaze. "I'll decide that, thank you." She didn't seem to believe Naomi. Something about her tone didn't sit well with Naomi, but she kept quiet and waited. She had learned that speaking up too much in such situations often made things worse. The officer took a few steps back, looking over the documents in her hand. Naomi felt a knot form in her stomach. She was used to the uncomfortable feeling that came with these encounters, but this officer seemed different. She wasn't asking the usual polite questions. There was an underlying tension in the air. Naomi glanced around, hoping this would end quickly. But then the officer returned with a different attitude. "Step out of the car," she ordered suddenly. Naomi blinked in surprise. "Excuse me, why? I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't answer directly. Instead, her eyes narrowed as if she was ready to escalate the situation. Naomi hesitated for a moment, but then slowly opened the door and stepped out of the car. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew better than to resist. As soon as she was outside the car, the officer moved closer, her posture rigid, almost like she was preparing for something to go wrong. "You're under arrest," the officer said, her voice cold. Naomi's heart raced. This was not how she had expected the evening to go. "What? For what?" Naomi asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She was in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. The officer didn't give a clear answer, only repeating that Naomi was under arrest for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine as the officer's words sunk in. She wasn't sure why she was being arrested, but something didn't feel right. The officer's actions seemed to be more about something else, something personal. Naomi was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a routine stop. It was turning into something much bigger. Naomi stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what was happening. Arrested? For what? Her mind raced, but before she could say anything else, the officer stepped closer and repeated the words, "You're under arrest." Naomi's heart started to pound faster in her chest as she tried to make sense of the situation. She wasn't resisting. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why was this happening? The officer, with an almost mechanical precision, began to handcuff Naomi's wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. Naomi flinched but kept her composure. She wasn't going to let this get the best of her. This had to be a mistake, but in that moment, she could feel the weight of something far worse, a reality she had lived through many times before. Racial profiling. Naomi's mind flashed to the countless stories of black people being unfairly treated by police, and now She was the one caught in it. "Why are you doing this?" Naomi asked again, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just stay quiet," the officer replied shortly, her tone flat. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Naomi's frustration grew, but she knew better than to argue. The last thing she needed was to escalate the situation further. She had been through enough situations like this to understand how quickly things could spiral out of control. All she wanted was to get home to her family. But now, everything was turning into a nightmare. The officer, still not explaining anything, began to guide Naomi toward her patrol car. As they walked, Naomi couldn't help but notice how people passing by were starting to stare. Some slowed their cars down, curious about the commotion. Naomi felt a mixture of embarrassment and anger rising in her chest. She was being humiliated in front of strangers for something she hadn't done. "Can I make a phone call?" Naomi asked as they reached the patrol car. She needed to contact someone, especially if this was going to escalate. The officer didn't respond right away. She seemed to consider Naomi's request for a moment before shaking her head. "Not until you're booked," she said curtly. Naomi sighed in frustration but said nothing. She was beginning to realize that the officer wasn't interested in hearing her side of the story. Naomi, who had spent years building a career, fighting for justice, and advocating for the very rights she was now being denied, felt a sharp pang of injustice. How could this be happening to her? She had worked so hard to be in a position where she could make a difference, and yet here she was, treated like a criminal. The officer opened the door of the patrol car, and Naomi was shoved inside. The small space felt suffocating as the officer slammed the door shut behind her. Naomi could hear the distant sound of sirens, but it felt surreal. It was like something from a nightmare. In the back of her mind, she kept reminding herself to stay calm, to stay composed. She had to think clearly. She had been in difficult situations before, and she would get through this one too. But the reality of being arrested without cause stung deeply. As they drove to the station, Naomi's thoughts raced. What would her colleagues think? What would her supporters think when they found out? And most importantly, how would this affect her work as a state senator? She had fought tirelessly to improve the lives of her community, especially people of color. And now it seemed like everything she had worked for could be shattered in an instant. As Naomi was driven to the police station, she sat in the back of the patrol car, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The streetlights flashed by, casting shadows through the small window, and she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had never imagined she would find herself in a position like this, but she couldn't let fear take over. She needed to stay composed, no matter what. When they arrived at the station, the officer opened the car door and roughly pulled Naomi out. Naomi felt the cold night air hit her face as she was led through the station's entrance. The harsh fluorescent lights of the police station flickered above her, making the place feel even colder and more sterile. Naomi's mind raced, but she did her best to stay calm. Inside, officers looked up as she was brought in, some glancing at her with curiosity, while others seemed uninterested. Naomi felt the stares, but she refused to let it affect her. She was used to people noticing her, but this time, it was different. It wasn't because of her position as a state senator or her achievements. It was because she was now the one being processed, treated like a criminal. The officer who had arrested her handed over her paperwork to the desk sergeant, explaining the charges, but Naomi could tell from the officer's tone that they didn't fully believe she was a threat. They were just going through the motions, making her life difficult for reasons she couldn't understand. Naomi had been calm and respectful. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was, facing the consequences of something she couldn't control. A few moments later, Naomi was taken to a small, cold holding cell. The officer slammed the door shut behind her, leaving her alone in the dimly lit room. Naomi sat on the bench, trying to process what was happening. She had been arrested for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct, charges that made no sense. She had done nothing more than assert her rights when the officer tried to escalate the situation. Naomi knew that these charges could have serious consequences, but she wasn't going to let this setback stop her. The longer she sat there, the more her frustration grew. This wasn't just an ordinary incident. This was about something much bigger. Naomi had fought for justice and equality her entire career, working tirelessly to make sure people like her weren't treated unfairly. And now she was being treated like a criminal, just because of her skin color. It was a painful reality that so many others had faced before her. But then, something unexpected happened. A couple of hours into her wait, a new officer walked in. He was different from the others, calm, professional, and with a respectful demeanor. Naomi looked up, her eyes narrowing as he approached. He introduced himself, but what caught her attention was what he said next. "I'm sorry for the trouble you've been through," he said. "I've just been made aware of who you are." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though a sense of unease was creeping in. The officer's face softened. "You're State Senator Naomi Cooper, aren't you?" Naomi nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going, but his recognition of her identity was a turning point. The officer's demeanor changed completely. He didn't seem to believe the charges, and it was clear he realized the seriousness of the situation. Naomi felt a flicker of hope, but she knew things weren't over yet. If her identity was going to change the way the officers treated her, she needed to make sure it counted. As the officer left the room to make a few calls, Naomi sat there, trying to control her emotions. The truth was, this wasn't just about her. It was about a larger issue, one that affected countless people across the country. Naomi had been given a platform to fight for equality, to push for change, but now she felt like she was living the very injustice she had worked to fix. She knew this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. The hours following Naomi's arrest felt like they stretched on forever. As the news of her situation started to spread, the atmosphere in the police station shifted. What had been a typical evening in the station quickly became a scene of activity. Officers moved more quickly. Phone calls were made, and whispers filled the halls. Naomi, sitting in her small holding cell, couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency building outside the walls. Something was changing, but she didn't know exactly what yet. Back outside, word of Naomi's arrest spread through the community like wildfire. Social media exploded with posts from her supporters, from local activists to everyday citizens who had admired her work for years. Hashtags like #JusticeForNaomi and #IndRacial Profiling began trending, and people started organizing protests in front of the police station. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but Naomi couldn't see any of it from where she was. She had been locked away, waiting to find out what would happen next. Back in the station, an officer came in to inform Naomi that her legal team had been contacted and that she would be allowed to make a phone call. Naomi felt a surge of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that her case was being taken seriously. The officer unlocked the door to her holding cell, and Naomi was led to a small room with a phone. She dialed her lawyer's number, hoping for a quick resolution. Her lawyer, a calm and experienced woman named Rachel, picked up after a few rings. Naomi quickly explained the situation, her voice tight with frustration. "I don't understand why this is happening, Rachel. I've been arrested for resisting arrest. I didn't even do anything. I just wanted to go home." Rachel's voice was steady, reassuring. "I know, Naomi. We'll get this sorted out. I'm already in touch with the district attorney's office. We'll make sure they understand that this is a mistake." Naomi felt a little better, but the words, "this is a mistake," echoed in her mind. She had been trying to be patient, trying to hold it together, but how could anyone misunderstand what had happened? She hadn't resisted anything. She had only tried to protect herself, to assert her rights when the officer had overstepped. Now, the weight of the situation was starting to press down on her. It wasn't just about the charges against her. It was about the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. Naomi sat back down on the bench, taking a deep breath. She had spent so many years fighting to change the system, to make it fairer, especially for people of color. And now, it was clear how deeply ingrained these problems were. She had been stopped and arrested simply because of who she was, a black woman. It was a painful reminder of the work still left to be done. As the hours passed, the scene outside grew louder. The protests began to intensify as more and more people showed up to stand with Naomi. Many of the protesters were people who had been inspired by her work, her speeches, and her commitment to making real change in their community. Now, they were chanting for her release, for justice. The voices outside were growing stronger, and Naomi knew it was just the beginning. Inside the station, things were also starting to shift. Officers who had previously been cold or indifferent began to speak more cautiously. Naomi had become the center of attention, but not in the way the officers had expected. They had underestimated the power of her identity, of her platform, and now, it seemed like things were going to change. The police station wasn't just dealing with an ordinary arrest anymore. They were dealing with the arrest of a state senator, someone who had the power to influence real change. Naomi wasn't just an individual facing injustice. She was a symbol of the very issues she had fought to address. And now, the eyes of the entire community, and possibly the nation, were on her. The pressure was mounting, and Naomi was ready to face it head-on. As the night dragged on, Naomi found herself in a quiet, dimly lit room at the police station, waiting for more updates. Her thoughts swirled, but she knew she had to stay strong. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. This situation had become much bigger than that. Her mind kept going back to the conversations she had had with her supporters, with her colleagues, and with the people she had fought so hard to represent. They had always believed in her, and now she had to believe in herself even more than ever. The officer who had treated her so harshly earlier had been replaced with someone more neutral, a man who spoke to her with professional distance. He was the one who told her that she would soon be transferred to a different room for questioning, but it wasn't his words that stuck with her. It was the way the station had begun to change. The energy was different. The earlier hostility had started to give way to a sense of discomfort, as though the officers knew they had made a serious mistake. When Naomi's legal team arrived, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Rachel, her lawyer, was quick to assure her that they were going to take action. The moment Naomi was allowed to sit down with her attorney, Rachel spoke firmly, outlining the steps they would take to fight this arrest. "This is a clear case of overreach," Rachel said. "We'll make sure the public knows that this was wrong. We'll also file a formal complaint against the officer who arrested you." Naomi nodded, grateful for her lawyer's calm presence. Rachel had been by her side through many battles in the past, always fighting with the same determination Naomi herself had. But this situation felt different. Naomi wasn't just a public figure or a politician anymore. She had become a symbol of something far larger than herself. She was now representing every black person who had been unfairly targeted by the system, every person who had felt the sting of racial profiling, every voice that had been silenced by injustice. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about proving that things could be different, that real change could happen. As they talked, Naomi could feel the pressure mounting outside the walls of the station. The protests had grown in size. She could hear the chants and the calls for justice reaching her ears. The supporters who had once rallied behind her in small groups were now making their voices heard in the streets, demanding accountability from the police. Naomi's name had become a rallying cry for fairness, and the police station was becoming a battleground for something much bigger than one arrest. It was a test for the justice system. Naomi knew the power of her platform. She had always understood the weight of being a public figure, but this felt different. She was no longer just a politician or a leader. She was now the face of a larger movement, a movement for equality, for justice, and for the recognition that people of color should not be treated as less than. She thought about her work in the Senate, the bills she had pushed forward to reform policing, to ensure that black people weren't unfairly targeted. This wasn't just theory anymore. It was real, and it was happening to her. As the hours passed, Naomi was finally allowed to speak in front of the cameras. The room was filled with reporters, all eager for her response. Naomi stood tall, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but she wasn't afraid. She had been fighting for justice her entire career, and now she had to stand up for herself. When she began speaking, her voice was strong and steady. "I've spent my life fighting for equality, for a world where people are judged by their character, not the color of their skin," she began. "Today, I am not just standing up for myself. I am standing up for every person who has ever been mistreated, for every person who has ever been unjustly targeted by the system. This must stop." Her words were powerful, and they resonated with those watching, both in the room and across the country. Naomi wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for all those who had been ignored, oppressed, and silenced. As she finished her statement, she felt a sense of determination settle over her. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of the next phase of her fight for justice. The battle was far from over, but Naomi knew she was ready to face whatever came next. The media coverage of Naomi's arrest quickly spiraled out of control as more news outlets began to pick up the story. It wasn't just about the arrest of a state senator anymore. It had turned into a nationwide conversation about racial profiling and police misconduct. Naomi's name was everywhere, from social media platforms to major news channels. People were talking about her courage and her refusal to be silenced. What had begun as a personal injustice had turned into something much larger, an opportunity to bring attention to the systemic issues that still plague many communities, especially communities of color. In the following days, Naomi met with her legal team, public relations advisors, and key allies in the Senate. Her phone rang off the hook with messages of support, but it also came with an overwhelming flood of challenges. Some wanted her to speak louder, to press harder for immediate action. Others cautioned her to stay measured, to avoid making the situation more volatile than it needed to be. But for Naomi, the message was clear. The system had to change, and it was her responsibility to make sure it did. During this time, Naomi took several important meetings to discuss the next steps. Rachel, her lawyer, had arranged a sit-down with key members of the police department, hoping to clear things up and potentially resolve the matter quietly. But Naomi knew that quiet resolutions weren't enough. The truth had to be exposed, and people needed to hear what had happened. She wasn't about to let this slide, not when it was clear the system needed to be held accountable. Naomi's team had already begun gathering evidence, everything from video footage of the traffic stop to eyewitness testimony from people who had been nearby when the arrest took place. The officer who had arrested Naomi was known for being part of a group of officers who had been under investigation for racial profiling in the past. Naomi wasn't surprised by this, but it gave her the fuel she needed to keep pushing forward. The pressure on the police department was increasing. Naomi's supporters were not backing down, and neither was she. Protests continued to grow in size, with people from all walks of life joining the cause. Signs and banners calling for justice filled the streets, and many of the protesters carried Naomi's image, her face a symbol of strength and defiance. Naomi had always fought for the rights of the marginalized, but now it felt like the entire nation was watching, waiting for her to lead the way. Inside the police department, things were starting to shift. Officers who had once been dismissive were now questioning the actions of their colleagues. The case was being reviewed, and internal investigations were underway. The pressure was mounting on the department, and the public's focus on Naomi's case was impossible to ignore. For Naomi, it was a difficult balancing act. She had to remain calm and composed while continuing to push forward with the case. The media attention was intense, and it was only growing as new details emerged. But despite the chaos, Naomi remained focused on her ultimate goal: to ensure that no one else had to go through what she had experienced. Late one night, after a long day of meetings and strategy sessions, Naomi stood in front of a mirror, looking at herself. The reflection staring back at her was a mix of exhaustion and determination. She knew that this fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been treated unfairly, every person who had been targeted by the very system that was supposed to protect them. She couldn't back down. She wouldn't. As the days passed, Naomi's resolve only grew stronger. She was no longer just a victim of injustice. She had become a voice for those who had been silenced, for those who had been overlooked by the very system meant to protect them. This was her chance to bring about real change, to push for accountability, and to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure what she had gone through. And as Naomi prepared for the next phase of her fight, she knew that this moment, this case, had the power to change everything. What began as a personal injustice was now a defining moment for the country, and Naomi was ready to lead the charge. As Naomi continued to deal with the fallout from her arrest, the world around her began to shift. What had initially been a single, highly publicized incident was now becoming a crucial turning point in the ongoing fight for justice. Naomi wasn't just facing the legal system. She was also facing a public that demanded change. The protests, which had initially been small, had now grown into a national movement. People all over the country were rallying behind Naomi's cause, echoing her call for police reform, fairness, and an end to systemic racism. The pressure was beginning to feel almost overwhelming, but Naomi had learned long ago to stand tall in the face of adversity. She had spent years advocating for her community and fighting for equality, and now it was time for her to put those lessons into action. She had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon for all those who had been mistreated and overlooked by the system. Yet, even as she stood firm in her resolve, Naomi couldn't help but reflect on how surreal it all felt. How had it come to this? Why had the system failed her so completely, despite her years of public service? During this time, Naomi's legal team had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence and preparing for the courtroom battle ahead. They were determined to hold the police accountable, and Naomi was resolute in her commitment to pursue justice. The department's investigation into the arrest was still ongoing, but Naomi knew that the true accountability would come from the broader changes that were needed. Her personal case could shine a light on the larger issues, but it was the reforms that mattered most in the long run. Naomi was ready to push forward, no matter what it took. Meanwhile, the media continued to cover the story, and Naomi became a fixture in the headlines. Every move she made, every statement she gave, was followed and analyzed by journalists. But despite the intense media scrutiny, Naomi remained focused on her goal. She was no longer just responding to what had happened to her. She was charting a path forward. Her voice was louder than ever before, and it was reaching all corners of the country. People who had once been unaware of the depth of the issues were now becoming actively engaged. It felt like a wave of awareness was sweeping over the nation, and Naomi was right at the center of it. With the growing support came increasing resistance, of course. The backlash from those who wanted to protect the status quo began to grow louder as well. Some politicians and public figures sought to discredit Naomi, casting doubt on her version of events. They tried to diminish the significance of what had happened, suggesting that it was just an isolated incident and not a symptom of a larger, more systemic problem. Naomi knew better than to be deterred by these attacks. They were only trying to silence her because they feared the change she represented. But Naomi was determined not to let them win. Behind closed doors, the conversations were just as heated. There were those within the government who supported her, praising her bravery and leadership in the face of injustice. Others were uncomfortable with how the case was unfolding, concerned about the political ramifications, but Naomi didn't let that stop her either. She had worked her whole career to earn her place at the table, and now she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't about politics, it was about people's lives. At one of the many rallies held in her support, Naomi took to the stage to speak. The crowd cheered, their energy palpable, as she stepped up to the microphone. "We cannot allow this to continue," Naomi began, her voice steady and strong. "I am here today not just for myself, but for every person who has been treated unfairly by the system. We cannot allow injustice to go unchallenged. We must hold those in power accountable, and we must push for the reforms that are long overdue. The crowd erupted in applause, but Naomi's mind was still focused on the road ahead. This wasn't just about the protests or the media attention. This was about the kind of future she wanted to build, a future where every person, regardless of their background or the color of their skin, could walk through the world with the same sense of dignity and safety. It was about ensuring that the voices of the marginalized were heard and that the system worked for everyone, not just a select few. Naomi knew that the fight was far from over, but she was more determined than ever. The waves of support from across the nation fueled her every step. She was a leader not just in her community, but now, in the fight for justice on a national scale. With every challenge she faced, Naomi only grew stronger. She had become the face of the movement, and she wasn't going to stop until real change had been made. As the weeks went by, Naomi's case continued to draw attention across the country. It had gone beyond just a local issue now. It had become a turning point for the entire nation. People were paying attention, asking questions, and demanding answers. The conversation about police reform, racial injustice, and the abuse of power was being discussed in every corner of the media. Naomi's story had sparked a movement, one that called for real change and for a system that served everyone, not just the privileged few. Despite the overwhelming support, Naomi knew the journey was far from over. There were still obstacles to overcome, and the battle ahead would be tough. Her legal team had been working around the clock, gathering evidence, preparing arguments, and making sure they were ready to take the case to court. But Naomi wasn't just relying on the legal system to fix everything. She understood that true change wouldn't come from the courts alone. It would require a shift in mindset, a change in the way people thought about race, justice, and power. Naomi continued to use her platform to speak out about the need for reform. She called for stronger oversight of the police, better training to prevent racial profiling, and more accountability for officers who crossed the line. It was clear that the system had to change, and Naomi was determined to be the one to push for that change. She had seen firsthand how deeply embedded these issues were, but she also knew how powerful a determined voice could be. On a personal level, Naomi was still feeling the emotional weight of everything she had been through. The stress of the arrest, the media frenzy, and the intense public scrutiny had taken its toll. Yet, even in the darkest moments, Naomi never lost sight of the bigger picture. She knew that every challenge she faced was one step closer to breaking down the walls of injustice, and the people who stood with her, the activists, the community leaders, and the everyday citizens who had rallied behind her, gave her the strength to keep going. One of the key moments came when Naomi received an unexpected call from a fellow senator. This senator, who had been following Naomi's case closely, offered her full support. He promised to back her efforts for police reform and to push for a nationwide conversation on racial injustice. Naomi appreciated the gesture, but she knew that the true test would come when the bills were put forward, when the decisions were made in the halls of power. Still, the support meant something. It showed that others in positions of influence were starting to recognize the need for change. Soon, a series of hearings were scheduled to address the concerns Naomi had raised. The hearings were filled with tension, as lawmakers from across the political spectrum debated what steps should be taken to address the issues of police misconduct and systemic racism. Naomi attended each session, speaking passionately about the importance of accountability, transparency, and reform. The room was full of people listening, some nodding in agreement, others hesitant but willing to engage. As time passed, Naomi started to see small victories. Her voice was being heard, her message was resonating with more people, and some of the changes she had been pushing for were beginning to gain traction. New laws were being proposed, training programs for officers were being reevaluated, and funding for community-based policing was being discussed. It wasn't everything Naomi wanted, but it was a start. She knew the road to full reform would be long, but this was progress. Throughout it all, Naomi remained grounded. She knew this wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced discrimination, who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever felt invisible. She was representing them all. And as she stood before a crowd at a rally to celebrate the progress they had made, Naomi felt a renewed sense of hope. She spoke to the crowd, her words filled with conviction and determination. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We've made great strides, but our work is far from finished. Together, we will continue to fight for a justice system that truly works for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, and Naomi felt a surge of pride. The battle for justice would never be easy, but she was ready to keep fighting. She had always believed that change was possible, and now she was seeing it unfold before her eyes. Naomi had started as an individual fighting for her rights, but now she was leading a movement. She had become the face of hope, of change, and of the belief that the fight for equality would always be worth it.